Okay, so in this video, we will introduce the terms variation, adaptation, fitness, and natural selection. I'm making this video for a general biology class and an introduction for a unit on natural selection. So let's go ahead and get started and define what is variation. So when we look at variation we can see here in these mice. We can see that there's different phenotypes. Remember, a phenotype are the physical appearances or physical traits or characteristics of an organism. And a lot of our phenotypes are actually based in our genetics. So when we talk about variation in this unit, we are talking about variation within a population. So a population being the same species. So a group of mice here, or like horses or puppies or goats or butterflies or fish or whatever species you are talking about. We're talking about any differences in phenotypes within that population. And if you remember, a population is a group of the same species living in a defined area. And so when we talk about variation in this unit, we're going to be talking about variation that is inherited. And so the phenotypes are phenotypes that are based on genetics that you inherit from parents and pass to offspring. So you can see here with these like two parent dogs, how they have, I don't know, what is that, 6 or 7 puppies, and there's variation or differences in their offspring. So even though they're coming from the same parents, there's variation in offspring and in that population. Same thing with the mice here. You can see that there's differences and variations among the mice. So when we talk about where does variation come from, variation comes from meiosis and sexual reproduction, or in like sexual reproducing populations, because of that crossing over, independent assortment, and random fertilization. So this is why when we look back at these parent dogs, and you can see that there's variation in all of their offspring, that's due to random fertilization, crossing over, and independent assortment, even though the parents are the same for all 6 or 7 or 8 of those puppies. So when you look at another source of variation, though, that's mutations. Mutations are the ultimate source of variation. So when we think about populations can be like individuals that reproduce through sexual reproduction or through asexual reproduction. And in asexual reproduction, that's basically making identical offspring. And so that would be mutations would be the source of variation in an asexually reproducing population. So when we look at mutations, though, I think we tend to think about mutations as being a negative term. Like you think, ooh, mutation, right away we think like, oh, that's bad. But it's not, or maybe it is. But sometimes mutations can be beneficial, but the majority of the time, mutations are actually neutral. So here, if I look at this picture of the rainforest, I can see that there are actually 4 frogs. 1, 2, 3, 4. And they're pretty well camouflaged. Their phenotypes help them to blend in their environment. So that green color is an adaptation for survival in this jungle. So a mutation happens though, and all of a sudden there's an offspring that's born with a bright green phenotype. So with that bright green phenotype, that actually has them stand out to predators. So that phenotype actually lowers their chance of survival. So that is actually not an adaptation. That was actually a harmful mutation that showed up in the offspring. Did it create variation? Yes, but it just so happens that it wasn't a good variant. A mutation could happen that creates maybe like a red phenotype in frogs. Now, because there's other red things in this jungle, maybe it's not as disastrous. Maybe it's a survivable phenotype variation, right? So mutations are a natural process. They're actually errors during S phase of the cell cycle when DNA replicates. So sometimes the enzymes in DNA replication just make mistakes during base pairing rules. So it constantly happens, just the same as when you type a paper or write a paper, you make spelling mistakes or punctuation or grammar mistakes. It happens all the time. And these mutations, they create variation. They are the source, the ultimate source of variation on Earth. So scientists actually have researched the mutation that creates or causes blue eyes, because if you remember, our DNA is what codes for our DNA is what codes for our phenotypes. So we have these things called genes, and these genes code for proteins, and the proteins you make give you your phenotype. So here, the gene that codes for blue eyes actually produces proteins that change the way light is absorbed and reflected in the eyeball. So the person has, if they inherit that mutation, they have blue eyes. So scientists have actually traced through like DNA analysis that gene for blue eyes, and they've actually concluded that it occurred in the first blue-eyed person was 6,000 years ago. And everyone with blue eyes today actually has inherited that same sequence of DNA for blue eyes. And you can see like blue eyes didn't increase your chance of surviving or decrease your chance of surviving. Blue eyes would be an example of a neutral mutation. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about variation within a population. So here I have some squirrels, and let's say that they mate and they have offspring. So due to sexual reproduction and crossing over, independent assortment, and random fertilization, there's variation in their offspring. And so when we think about, let's say over multiple generations, they have lots of litters. I don't know if it's called a litter with squirrels, but they have a lot of babies over time. And so when we look at this population, there's more offspring than can possibly survive, right? That's going to be intense competition for resources. So here you have lots of offspring. More are born than can survive. So here we put them in the forest and they're living. Now, some of them are going to get eaten by predators. Maybe their phenotype that they were born with has them stand out and they're not very well camouflaged, so predators find them. Or maybe they're not very good at finding food, so they starve to death or they get out-competed, right? And so when we look at variation within a population, and you look at all of the offspring born in one generation, some of them are going to be better at surviving than others. So whatever traits that they inherited, whatever their phenotypes were that they were born with, gives them an advantage at surviving, and that is called an adaptation. So any individuals that have inherited traits that make them better able to survive, they've inherited adaptations for a particular, there goes another one, for a particular environment. Now, when we think about who gets to survive, it's the ones that are better suited for their environment. Maybe they're faster at finding food. Maybe they're camouflaged better. Maybe they can escape predators. Maybe they hunt at different times, right? So when we think about the individuals who survive, it's the ones who have phenotypes that are very well suited for that particular environment. So when we talk about individuals surviving and reproducing, we call this natural selection. Individuals with phenotypes better suited for their environment survive and reproduce. And so the next generation, like when we think about, well, what's going to happen to the squirrel population over time or over generations? Oh, there goes another one. So when we think about this, well, first let's define fitness. So here, fitness, what we saw in the squirrel example, is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. So high fitness means that you live a long time, many years or many generations, and you have lots of offspring. So your phenotype, whatever traits you inherited, give you a selective advantage. You are better able to survive than others, and therefore if you survive, you get to reproduce, and therefore your genes are in the next generation. So that would be a high fitness phenotype. So here it's these like dark brown, well camouflaged squirrels that are high fitness. Then the low fitness would be the squirrels that were selected against, the ones who got eaten by predators because they were not well camouflaged, or the ones who couldn't find food, or if you're like a deer, the ones who didn't run fast enough to escape the wolves. Low fitness means you don't survive long enough to get to reproduce. So high fitness is measured with how many offspring you have throughout your life. A very high fit individual is going to live a long time and produce lots of offspring. Now, living a long time alone does not mean high fitness. It has to be a combination of survive and reproduce. And you measure fitness based on the number of offspring in the next generation. A low fitness phenotype means that you did not survive long enough to have lots of offspring. So your inherited traits did not give you an advantage at surviving. Okay, so when we look at our surviving squirrels, our high fitness squirrels here, this phenotype was selected for, has a high fitness. They reproduce through sexual reproduction, and again, their offspring have variation. So when we look at their offspring, maybe it's not the same variation as the previous generation, but there's still variation. And within this population, there will be natural selection occurring as well. Maybe those brown squirrels will be the ones that survive and reproduce, and that light brown phenotype will be selected against. So you can imagine over time constantly selecting for phenotypes that give an advantage at survival. You can see how a population can evolve to become better suited for a particular environment. But it's also super important to realize that you need variation. And we'll see examples of that as we go through this unit. Okay, so this is called a riparian habitat. It's like an ecosystem along a stream. So if we look at this riparian ecosystem, there's a population of beetles. So if we look at the beetles, let's go ahead and just remove the background. So we can see that there's variation. There's different colors of beetles. And some of the phenotypes give a high fitness, and some phenotypes are low fitness. So the ones that are not very well camouflaged and get eaten by predators, we would say have a low fitness. And then, so over time, when we think about a generation or a population, there are more individuals born than will survive. And there's going to be a struggle for existence, right? Like a struggle of competition, escaping predators, etc. And so when we think about the individuals who have high fitness, those are the members of the population who survive and reproduce. So if the phenotypes that had low fitness don't have offspring, those genes that give like the bright green color are not going to be as prevalent in that next generation. So here, after the predators have eaten your beetles, you're going to find that the survivors are the ones who get to reproduce, and you can see a shift in the phenotypes of the offspring to be better camouflaged. We call this adaptive evolution, where over time the population as a whole is adapting to a particular environment. So here, if we have a population of mice, and there's two phenotypes. We have the gray mice, and then we have the like tan colored mice. And the ones obviously been looking at this, the gray mice or black mice are very well camouflaged. They have a high fitness. It's difficult to see them if you're a predator. The tan colored mice actually have a low fitness and are picked off by predators. So the survivors are the ones who reproduce. And you can see in that next generation, there's a greater amount of dark or black mice compared to tan. So that population has changed over time. It has more dark phenotypes compared to light phenotypes. So it's a changing population or an evolving population. Okay, so when we look at these birds, you can see that one bird has variation in its offspring. Not all survive. The ones who do survive reproduce. And let's pretend they live in like a cave-like environment where the darker the phenotype, the higher the fitness. So you can see over time how that population is changing, dependent on natural selection and survival of the fittest. So when we talk about natural selection, It's a process by which individuals that are better suited to their environment survive and reproduce most successfully. It's also called survival of the fittest. So we'll look at one more example here about some deer. So here we have a deer that's pretty well camouflaged. So with this, I couldn't get the exact deer using clip art, but you can see how there's variation within a population. Now I want to point out that when we talk about the evolution of a population or a species, evolution means change over time. So when we saw back here, this population is evolving because it's changing over time. The phenotypes are becoming darker over the generations. If we look back at the mice example, again in this one, the phenotypes are becoming darker over the generations. So this population is evolving. It's changing. Evolution just means change over time. And natural selection is one of the ways it happens. So here, when we look at this, it's the individuals do not evolve, but rather it's the whole population that is changing over time. So when you look at this population of deer, some of them are going to have a low fitness, that maybe they don't camouflage, they can't escape the predators on the cliff sides, and you have fewer survivors. The survivors are high fitness. They survive and they reproduce. So we say that some phenotypes are selected for, and the ones who didn't survive and have low fitness, we say are selected against. Now the phenotypes selected for reproduce, and you can see how that next generation has slightly different phenotypes than the previous. So if a population is changing over generations or over time, we say that population is evolving. But one single deer isn't changing over time. The deer was born with its fur color. It either camouflages or it doesn't. It survives or it doesn't. So it's not an individual that changes over time, but rather the population as a whole is changing over time. Okay, so also to review, an adaptation is an inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. Again, it's inherited. You can't choose your phenotype. Like this deer that was selected against, that yellow deer, it was born with yellow fur and it wasn't well camouflaged. It can't wish and change its fur to be better camouflaged. So when we talk about fitness and adaptations, these are inherited traits that help an individual survive. And it's not a choice, really. Like they can't want to change. Like we'll see later in the week about the finch beaks on the island of the Galapagos. A bird born with a large beak or a small beak can't wish its beak to change size, right? It either survives or it doesn't, depending on which beak it inherited. Okay, so now can an organism choose to adapt? And the answer is no. Adaptations are inherited traits. Like I'm 5'2". I can't choose to be taller or choose to be shorter. Okay, so just if we look at camouflage animals, you can see how these phenotypes that help them camouflage were selected for because the organisms who were better camouflaged or better suited for their environment survived and had offspring, which leads to the process of natural selection and individuals, about populations evolving over time to be incredibly suited for particular environments. Now, if mutations happen, though, and a phenotype is not well camouflaged or not suited for a particular environment, now that individual would have low fitness. And this is why you don't really see a lot of albino animals in nature. It actually gives them a disadvantage at surviving and reproducing. All right. So that is the end of my introduction to natural selection, and I hope that it was helpful for you. So good job, my sweet students.